Good evening, everyone. So the title of my talk this evening is Power Paths. And I mean that in both ways, yet to be illuminated, but in a couple different ways, both in terms of power and energy that we see in the development of oil and electricity and so forth, but also in terms of leadership. What kind of leadership qualities does it mean to have power, and how do we attain power? How do we exercise that power, both formally and informally? And I want to kind of wrap it around environmentally sustainable economic development in Indian country. So I hope this is interesting and helpful. I want to thank Adele and miss her terribly at the Department of the Interior. We were cohorts for just a few months, and then she left me, and I sort of had to kind of grapple around to figure out what exactly I'm supposed to be doing and the whole institution of this enormous federal government. And thank you also, Heather and Dean, and thank you, Professor Strickland, for the honor of this lecture as well. I've had a wonderful day at the law school. I enjoyed my conversation with Joe Bushyhead and the students, talking about career pathways and options and opportunities of new lawyers. It's a great time to be a young lawyer. There's so much work to do, and I know each of you are going to have a great future ahead of you. It's a great time to enter the practice of Indian law. There's still treaty rights to be resolved. There's still many sovereignty rights to be secured. There's so many options, and like I said, so much good work that yet needs to be done. As Adele can attest, public service is both challenging and enormously rewarding. So think of government work, perhaps, as one of your pathways to practicing law. It's a great honor for me to give this particular lecture, unbeknownst to Professor Strickland. His work on the Osage Constitution in the 1990s informed much of my own work with several tribes on their constitutions. For example, I worked with the Meskwaki, the Sac-and-Fox of the Mississippi and Iowa on their constitution, the Mash and Tuckapequot tribe in Connecticut in developing their own very basic constitution, and with the Tule River tribe in California, a whole nother history that had very curious and particular considerations. So the principles of his work on constitutions endure today in many ways and in many forms. I'm also so happy to be joined here by two of my most favorite people, my daughters, Carrie and Jennifer Hartman. In fact, they've been at my side through most of my entire journey as a lawyer. First as a law student when they were young girls, little ones, when I was going to law school, and then through my various positions as a practicing lawyer and law professor. They've also been my best travel companions, and we're having a great adventure out here in Oregon. A few weeks ago, when I was asked to provide a synopsis of my presentation, my talk tonight, I had a lot of things on my mind. The election, of course. I was very concerned about the election and my position and next steps, if the election would not go for Obama. I had on my mind also Secretary Salazar's recent decision to take land into trust for the at Fort Berthold for the 3 affiliated tribes. The tribes want to build an oil refinery on that land. I was thinking about the death of Russell Means, an Indian warrior who I met as a young girl. And then I was thinking about the canonization of the blessed Kateri Tekakwitha of the Mohawk Nation. I also had a recent experience with my smartphone where one simple email went viral within my own family, and it caused quite a chain reaction. So this made me think about the power of technology to compel people to act in both large ways and small ways, big circles and small circles. So I'm sure you're asking yourselves, what does all of this have to do with environmental stewardship? Well, let me see if I can piece this together into a brilliant mosaic. First, the election results. May I say that I'm very happy that we have Obama for another administration. We have much work to do, a lot of important work, and work that builds on what we've done what this administration has done in the last 4 years. About the Fort Berthold oil refinery. Last month, Secretary Salazar visited the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. He met with Chairman Tex Hall, and he approved a land into trust application that was submitted by the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. Fort Berthold today is a much different place than it was in 1901 when my grandfather was born there, in a little tiny town called Elbow Woods. That place was one of many Indian towns that was flooded along the Missouri River, flooded for irrigation, flood control, hydroelectric power. None of those projects, though, at all benefited directly the 3 affiliated tribes, although their land was confiscated and the project was built thereon. So the 3 affiliated tribes will build the first new oil refinery in the United States in more than 30 years, and the only tribally owned oil refinery in the lower 48. The refinery will process much of the oil and gas product from the Bakken Formation. This is the source rock that the oil is extracted from by fracking. And I'm sure you've heard much about crazy fracking activities. The long-term environmental and economic impacts from these and other fracking activities and the refinery operation are not readily quantifiable at this time. But we know that the magnitude of those impacts will be huge. Tex Hall knows, both as a businessman and as a tribal leader, that sustainable economic and environmental development on that reservation, his reservation, and for his people, requires a solid cultural base. It requires collaboration beyond reservation borders. It requires innovative and far-reaching thinking and very strong, determined leadership. Well, what about Russell Means? He was a modern-day Indian warrior. He was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1939 and died just recently on October 22nd. I first met Russell Means as a young girl, maybe about 13 or 14 years old in Minnesota. In the 70s, he was a scrappy young man. He was wearing torn jeans and dirty t-shirts, and his face just looked tired and worn, but very determined. He was a rising leader of the American Indian movement at that time, AIM. In November of 1972, he participated in AIM's occupation of the BIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I can see that from my office window. He was there to protest the dire conditions on Indian reservations, particularly Pine Ridge, but those conditions that were wrought by decades of abuse by Indian agents and a century of broken treating promises. In 1973, Russell Means and Dennis Banks led AIM's occupation of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation. This was a protest against a corrupt tribal government. The armed standoff of more than 300 Lakota and AIM activists with the FBI and state law enforcement lasted over 71 days. His message at that time was social justice. He wanted social justice and just justice, plain old justice for Indian people. The next time I met Russell Means was in the 1990s. He was a celebrity, and his status had zenith. Do you remember Last of the Mohicans, Pocahontas? Russell became a movie star. I was working for the Mashantucket Pequot tribe then and was asked to review his contract as MC for the tribe's famously large powwow, Skimitzen. Russell requested a fancy hotel room. He wanted special food, special drinks, he wanted a security escort, and he wanted a fully equipped trailer at the powwow. When he emerged from the trailer, he was wearing super flashy red silk shirts, tight white jeans, and aviator sunglasses. He certainly was an attention seeker, and he garnered both international attention for the plight of the Indian people in the 70s, and he was a courageous militant. He was a protester, and later, through the power of his own celebrity status, he still drew attention to the concerns and problems and consternations of Indian people. To me, he was a righteous troublemaker. He was born into a humble home, and he died a very humbled man. Saint Kateri. Do you know about this incredible spiritual woman? She has stirred such a controversy in Indian communities recently. Kateri Tekakwitha was born in 1656 to a Mohawk chief and a Catholic Algonquin mother, about 40 miles northwest of Albany, New York, in the heart of Iroquois territory. She was orphaned at 4 years old when smallpox wiped out her family and much of her village and left her blinded and disfigured. At age 20, she converted to Catholicism and settled in Kanawaki, a Mohawk settlement where the Jesuits had a very large mission. Another movie you could watch is The Black Robe, very dark and odious, but very telling. There she performed rituals, both native rituals and Catholic rituals of self-mortification as part of her faith. Upon her death just a few years later, at age 24, Kateri's smallpox scars were reportedly vanished. So last month, she was canonized in Rome, and the canonization was attended by my sister and her daughter, Kateri. I was also scheduled to go, but work has kept me in Washington, D.C. But there were hundreds of Indians from around the United States and in Canada. And my niece, Kateri, met many other young girls named Kateri. Pope Benedict XVI spoke of Kateri's culture and faith and noted how unusual it was in Kateri's culture at that time to devote herself to the Catholic religion. Kateri was a transitional figure. She was a bridge between her native culture and Christianity. She, along with the Jesuits who had learned the native languages and tried their best to present the Christian faith using native words and phrases and concepts from the native cultures. Some Mohawks today and other Indians are skeptical about the naming of the first Native American saint. They fear that the Catholic Church is using it to shore up its own image and to marginalize Native spiritual practices. They see the story of Kateri Tekakwitha as yet another reminder of colonial atrocities and religious oppression. But I see the story of Kateri Tekakwitha differently. She kept her traditions, she kept her language alive, and despite the pressure from the non-Indian regime, she didn't wholly change and adopt to the European way. She kept her soul intact, her native soul intact. And that is what I hope for my niece, Kateri, as well. Keeping her culture through the powwow dance, through the Lakota language, and ties to the land at Standing Rock. Okay, now do you know Ahmed ElMofty? He's a soft-spoken rebel. He's the instigator of the Arab uprising. He was an anonymous tinker who deployed his technology talents to outwit an oppressive government and help secure political freedom in his country. ElMofty's simple goal was to secure a way for the Libyans to talk to one another. Gaddafi wanted just the opposite. He was preparing to shut down the nation's mobile telephone network. He wanted no communication from within his country outside its borders. But ElMofty and his cohorts found a way to work around the national network, and they reconfigured the entire national mobile phone system. Then they told the world about the government atrocities by stretching an internet line across the Libyan border to Egypt. Through his social media networks, ElMofty pressed for the redress of his country's deplorable conditions. The Arab Spring Revolution was not as much about technology, but technology definitely played an important role in it. To me, ElMofty's account of his high-risk digitalized adventure in the midst of the Arab Spring uprising holds a special resonance with the historical actions of Tex Hall and Russell Means and Kateri Tekakwitha. All of them have several traits in common. They were rebels and innovators. They were tinkerers and deep thinkers. They bridged cultures and they united peoples. They also carried with them a cultural imperative. These, to me, are the traits of noble leaders. Most of the time, they had no formal authority to act. They acted in place and in time and in history. For Tex Hall, the Fort Berthold refinery project will require a carefully attuned business and financial plan, a lot of technological innovation and consideration of the profound impacts that energy development will have on the reservation and in the community. To succeed, he must ameliorate a host of environmental and cultural impacts. He must educate his people. He must build strong institutions, both governmental and social institutions, to weather the looming changes that the oil business will bring to his community. Russell Means and St. Kateri remind us about the cultural factionalism that still persists throughout our country. Russell's death and Kateri's saintly elevation also should prompt us to think about what unites us, keeping spiritual traditions and native languages alive and vibrant, healing the old wounds and reconciling the history of colonization and a Native American narrative, bridging intercultural relations and building alliances across border lines, stretching out social and digital networks as well within our communities and beyond, where we can convene to share our stories, to lend support, and be righteously rebellious. For American Indians and Alaska Natives, our moral imperative now is to build strong foundations for a prosperous future. How do we do this? Well, I think in 4 primary and significant ways. We have to reduce violence on Indian reservations and in Indian communities. We have to reform Indian education. We must restore the Indian land base, and we have to demand tribal consultation. The 2 most serious risks threatening American Indians today are the high rates of violence, both on and off the reservation, and poor educational attainment. We have to reduce violence in Indian country, period. This administration has committed tremendous resources to aggressively confront violence in Indian country. We've provided additional law enforcement to support tribes. We've increased and enhanced tribal prosecutorial authority and built additional detention facilities. We're expanding treatment services within tribal communities, but this certainly is not enough. The foundation for this effort is the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, which supports the capacity of tribes to enforce their own criminal laws against non-Indian perpetrators in tribal court. And this effort means more police on the ground. It means better response times to emergency calls and thorough investigations of violent crimes. But these efforts, as good as they are, result in more stress within the community and an intensive need for social services and support to the children and families who have experienced violence or who have experienced the consequences of violence in their homes. This requires noble-minded and clear-sighted leadership. We believe that the propensity for violence in a given community can be positively impacted by quality educational opportunities for Indian children. In Indian country, this means that we have to reform Indian education and improve educational opportunities and outcomes for children who are educated in reservation-based school and BIA-funded schools. We have to improve educational standards for children, and this means we have to retain and recruit and retain teachers who will be committed, who will make long-term commitments to our children. We must rebuild decrepit schools, enhance students' learning environments, and we have to encourage technology to build knowledge networks. Educational reform is not quick work in any government, and this administration knows that it has to be done collaboratively, culturally, and hand in hand with tribal leadership. So ensuring high standards and better educational outcomes for Indian children must be everyone's priorities. The next way we do this is restoring the tribal land base. When the Obama administration began 4 years ago, there was a de facto moratorium on trust land acquisitions. The prior administration had only acquired about 15,000 acres in trust for Indian tribes. Many of this land had been taken from Indians either through sale or cessions, treaties, and purchase. Since 2009, the Department of the Interior broke that logjam and has acquired more than 180,000 acres of land into trust for the use and benefit of Indian tribes. We've processed over 1,000 requests for land acquisitions, and this will allow tribes to develop agricultural projects, energy projects, improve their infrastructure, build health facilities and houses, and to move forward and strengthen their economies. Once land is in trust, it becomes the federal government's responsibility. And Indian country deserves responsive and responsible business practices from Interior that will help tribes manage their lands and comply with our own trust obligations to Indian tribes. Since my tenure at the department, our top-notch team has worked tirelessly on overhauling the department's regulations governing leases on Indian lands. The department's new leasing regulations will govern business leases, wind and solar leases, and residential leases. We hope that these leases will be published in the very near future, maybe by the end of this week, and they will actually go a long way in promoting housing and economic development on Indian lands. They will increase efficiency and transparency in the BIA approval process, and most importantly, they will defer to tribal decisions regarding the use of their lands. Along with the recently enacted Hearth Act, which is a lot about housing and giving tribes authority to do their own leasing approval, these changes will mark the most substantial changes to improving housing and leasing on tribal lands in over 50 years. They also recognize the significant and pivotal role of tribes in designing their own futures. And one of the most important priorities of this administration has been the production and development of renewable energy. And this includes renewable energy projects on Indian lands, and this is very exciting. Renewable energy development on Indian lands is crucial because it creates jobs, it provides great training opportunities, it provides and generates revenue, it diversifies tribal economies, it promotes tribal self-sufficiency and infrastructure development, and it assists the nation, the large nation, in meeting its renewable energy goals. Did you know that while Indian lands comprise only 5% of the land area of the United States, which in itself is really quite significant, those Indian lands contain 10% of all energy resources in the United States? It's phenomenal, the opportunity energy development has in Indian country. Our collective challenge, though, is to create an Indian energy strategy that safely and responsibly expands our nation's domestic energy resources. We also know that tribal lands hold great capacity for solar, wind, and geothermal projects. In June, the Secretary approved the first ever utility-scale solar project on tribal lands. The Mawapa Band of Paiute Indians of Nevada are deeply involved in this trailblazing effort to develop a 350 megawatt solar energy project that will help power over 100,000 homes and generate 400 jobs at peak production. Everything we do at Interior and everything we are attempting to do in the future is in collaboration with tribal leaders. In 2011, the Secretary signed the Tribal Consultation Policy with federally recognized tribes, and just last month, we issued a consultation policy for Alaska Native corporations. Both of these are available on the Interior's web pages. When President Obama took office, he pledged that his administration would not just uphold a government-to-government relationship with tribes, but a nation-to-nation relationship. In addition to consultation, we have developed a comprehensive agenda to reform, restructure, and rebuild a myriad other federal regulations that have important and significant impacts in Indian country. And we have to do this with tribes, not aside from tribes, but along with tribes, to ensure that American Indians get the opportunities they deserve. This means we have to respect inherent tribal sovereignty, that they have inherent rights, that they have to be at the table making decisions, and making sure that the federal government is honoring its own commitments. This means that the federal government must fulfill its trust responsibilities in word and in practice. This also means that we need to work cooperatively to build stronger economies within tribal reservations, and this means safer communities as well. We do this by honoring the vision of tribal leaders like Tex Hall, both formal leaders and informal leaders. We have to respect what they want for their nation, and we have to be partners helping their communities and cultures flourish. It's imperative that American Indians and Alaska Natives have a strong voice, their own voice be heard in the policies that affect their communities. In closing, tribal leadership in this age of scarcity, and we're already seeing the consequences of reduced budgets, the narrowing of the band of resources available. So in this age of scarcity, we have to have foresight and fortitude. We have to have strategic responses. We need to use available and limited resources and funding to maximize the benefit within Indian communities. It cries out for innovative solutions to long-festering problems of violence and education and jurisdictional conundrums. We need to pool and share our resources whenever possible. We need to resolve disputes outside of litigation through intergovernmental memorandums of agreement. There's no doubt that much work remains to be done by all of us in any capacity and in all the capacities that we have to offer. We can't obscure the best elements of tribal sovereignty, the spirituality, the traditions, the dreamers and the innovators, the righteous rebelliousness, the resilience and persistence. Native Americans must be full partners in our nation's economy. They must thrive in their own communities, safe and secure, and they must flourish in health and educational achievement. They must rise up and celebrate their own history and bravely create their own space in this digitized, driven world, but culturally steeped in their own customs and traditions. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions about those interesting figures or what we're doing in the Department of the Interior, I'd be happy. The question is, what do we do? What do we think about? How do we incorporate culturally significant and sacred sites? And that's an extremely important point. And it goes to the cultural connection that has to be acknowledged and factored into any economic development. Many tribal sacred sites are off reservation. Many of them are beyond the borders over which the tribes exercise their sovereign power. And so to do this and to be mindful that these sites are sacred, these places are rich in history and culture, tribes have to deploy a lot of political and economic clout. I've seen examples of this where tribes working with local governments will actually acquire through purchase those sites. I've seen tribes working with state governments to set aside these lands, so to make them unavailable for development, commercial development or housing development. But tribes have to be assertive in this as well. They need to be strategic and align themselves, and, go over the border, meet with the governor, meet with the county, and build an understanding as to why these are mutually beneficial. The protection and preservation of these sites are beneficial. Tribes can attain treatment as a state and stretch out their authority to encompass land and water and air beyond their reservation borders. They can do that under the law. I've seen in many situations where NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Act, allows tribes to reach out beyond their reservations to claim an interest and hopefully reclaim cultural patrimony from within those sites. I've seen tribes be very innovative in securing and preserving those sites. The National Historic Preservation Act, for example, is also another way to deploy the law. We love deploying the law. We're lawyers. That's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. But we also need to deploy really savvy political skills and social skills, and to get buy-in from the non-Indian community as to why these sites are important to be preserved for all of us. And I noticed that you have a cemetery on your campus, and what a sacred place that is. I noticed it was a Pioneers Cemetery, and what a history that must have. Yes? Thank you for that question. That really hits home for me. The New York Times, by the way, I asked Heather to print this out because it concerns me gravely. The headline is, "Washington steps back from policing Indian lands even as crime rises." A few years ago, I went to Harvard for a year, and I took a class on statistics and economics, and I also had an independent study where I really looked at the data about violence in Indian country. I wanted to know where those numbers came from. I wanted to know really what did those numbers mean, and how are they being used and deployed in terms of a policy prerogative. And what I learned was very disturbing. One, the data are very old, 2004, and now we're in 2012, almost 2013. Number two, the data comes from so many different sources. They're not measuring or counting the same things. So we don't know about sexual assault, we don't know about violent crime, we don't know perpetrators, and we don't know locality. So what can we really construct from this data? And we also know that many, many crimes are not reported. So as bad as we think or we know crime is in Indian country, it's probably a whole lot worse than we really know. And what we're lacking in that data is a cultural connection, the context of what's going on in the community. And we have to use that and understand that in the sense that Indians are very transient. They're both on the reservation and off the reservation. My own family at Standing Rock in North and South Dakota move on and off the reservation. And that's very much the way it is in Indian country. But most recently, the federal government said we are going to take a couple of Indian communities and we're going to throw all of our resources and see what we can do and make a difference. And they took Standing Rock, my mother's tribe, my mother's reservation. And it was a surge. They called it a surge. A lot more police on the ground, a lot more arrests. They went to tribal court. They were not only arrested, they were prosecuted, and now they're in jail. But that's just a tiny piece of it, because why is there crime? And what is instigating this crime? Well, a lot of it has to do with poverty, and we all know, or should know, that many reservations are dire islands of poverty. We also know that there's a tremendous problem with alcoholism on the reservation. My family is steeped in all of that as well. And we know that educational, plays a big part of it. Without tools and to equip oneself to deal with the harsh realities of poverty and some social dysfunction and the historical piece of it as well. So there's a lot more going on than a man raping a woman, a non-Indian raping an Indian woman. There's a lot more than a drunken Indian shooting or stabbing another Indian man. And we need a lot more resources other than police. We need people in those communities working with families, working with children, treatment centers, and so forth. So I think we need to think differently about violence. We need to examine that data. We need to figure out from the communities themselves the propensity for violence and get at it at the root cause and to build stronger, safer communities. And that doesn't mean always putting somebody in jail. The cost of incarceration is phenomenally high, but we're not treating the underlying issues. Oh, there are lots. That's a great question. And when I was at the University of South Dakota at the Institute of American Indian Studies, I had a young man from Oklahoma, and he was Miccosukee. And he had a great effort, part of his own work, to rebuild sustainable food cultures within tribes. Now, many reservations are very far away, and they do not have good grocery stores. They do not have good outlets for fresh food, good food. And what you see is worse and worse health factors, diabetes, hypertension, strokes, a lot of bad problems. And we don't see, a lot of creative thinking about how do we get healthy-minded as well as healthy in our body and in our spirit. And so a lot of, there are several really good ones in California, New York, Oklahoma, about being healthy. But being healthy is an educational process. And to start very, very young. I was working with the Yankton Sioux tribe and the Rosebud Sioux tribe not too long ago, before I went to Washington, which seems just like the time has passed so fast. So actually it was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And I was on the reservation, and I was in a meeting and I saw several young children, and they had bottles, and they had bottles of pop. Their mothers put pop in their bottles, and they were just drinking pop. And they were eating chips and Cheetos and things like this. And the only place they could get food was a convenience store. And the convenience store only sold, beef jerky and candy bars and pop, soda and such like this. And they didn't have the resources to drive 60 miles to a grocery store to get the good food, to make the good food, to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So healthy food goes along with healthy education. And this starts in schools themselves. And Pine Ridge, for example, has just started an educational program about healthy eating and about healthy lifestyles, about getting around and moving. Michelle Obama's, for example, Let's Move, has actually gone out to Indian education, Indian country. But Indian schools are, and I think this gets to your point, I think it does, need to be in charge of their own curriculum. And part of that curriculum, and I saw this at Rosebud in particular, incorporates the cultural components, the historical cultural components. They were hunters and gatherers, and what does that mean in a modern day? How do we express that, that historical cultural effort in terms of sustaining ourselves, our bodies, and our mind? And so you'll see gardens, you'll see classes, cooking classes. And my daughter Carrie worked at the Yankton Sioux Reservation and teaching them language. And the language incorporates the word for seed and the word for food. And it's all a matter of coming together very culturally. But not only is it language and history, but also tools for the future. Because what we're finding, and I can say this being from the University of South Dakota, that the Indian students coming from the reservations were way far below even the entering students from the small schools in South Dakota. It's a very, very rural state. And when I think about technology, I think we need technology on Indian reservations to allow them to be equal participants in the learning, the digital learning classroom. And that means math, that means science, that means biology, it means psychology as well. One of the roles I had at the university was working through a scholarship program. And this was a full scholarship for 5 Indian students from around the state. And I was reviewing applications from students who wanted to attend the University of South Dakota. And one young man's application just, wowed me. He had a terrific SAT or ACT score. I'm not sure, is 29 a good score? Something like that. It was just phenomenal. It was really, really high. But then I read his personal essay, and this young man had no running water. This young man had no electricity in his house. He ran a hose, or his mother ran a hose, 2 hoses, 100 length from another trailer. They also ran an extension cord from trailer to trailer to trailer, and they had 1 light. And that's how he did his homework. But for him and for his mother, education was the priority. He could go to school and have good grades, but it was beyond just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was the whole package. So you had to have a vision of what does education mean, and what can you bring it back to the community. So that's sort of a long-winded response that brings in a lot of other factors, but it cannot be understated, the importance of kind of a holistic educational vision for Indian children. Is that okay?